The anniversary cake was too big for the room. It sat under a halo of pendant lights, layers of white frosting and gold leaf that made the hotel ballroom look like a borrowed palace. Vivian Wen stood at the center of the circle, one hand on the microphone and the other resting over the rounded silk of her dress, where the announcement settled like a promise. Behind her, the banners of Wen Group were a soft blur. The cameras, company, friends, a single business outlet, kept their polite distance. Her lips curved in the way she had learned to manage in boardrooms and bedrooms, a reflexive, composed smile that read as gratitude and command at once. "I have some news," she said. Her voice was confident, even warm. She used Julian's full name when she turned toward him, the private name that folded them together in 1,000 small rituals. "We're expecting." The applause hit like surf against a cliff. Julian's smile was practiced and immediate, the way he had learned to stand beside a woman who could still carry a room when she wanted to. Serena, at the edge of the circle, Vivian's sister, her face bright with something too eager, had already lifted a glass and was watching Julian the way a jury watches a favored witness. Vivian felt the warmth of the applause like a distant sun. She could not see it. The world had already gone soft and charcoal at its edges for her, the way voices blurred into texture, the way light became texture too, hot, sharp, unreachable. She had learned to take in life by sound and scent, by the pressure of a husband's hand on her back. Tonight, she let those senses carry her through the ritual. There were photographs afterwards. Julian cupped her elbow and posed as though he were proud. He kissed the curve of her jaw, gentle, and for a moment Vivian felt the private domestic tenderness she had imagined forever. Two people against the world. There was a little joke about how the new boardroom baby would be forced to learn shareholder reports at nap time. Vivian laughed. Inside, something tightened, a memory of a previous winter when a chair had been pushed too quickly across the floor and the world had narrowed to sound and the shape of a hand finding the banister. She tucked that tightening away because she had learned to make herself useful. Mother, CEO, injured but not fragile. It was a small thing, the way Julian's gaze wandered as drinks were poured. He would catch her hand, then take it away, as if setting a chess piece in place. He held conversation with clients and then, with practiced ease, with Serena, as if nothing was there. Touches brushed shoulders that lasted a beat too long, laughter at private jokes. Vivian noticed the shift the way she noticed the change in the hum of the air conditioning unit. Subtle, but it meant the world had begun to rearrange. After the speeches and the cake, while the photographers eked out their last frames beneath the gold light, Vivian excused herself. She told Julian it was the restroom. She told him she needed water. He kissed her forehead, and she felt that brief, clean pressure of his lips. He did not ask her to stay. The restroom was empty except for the hum of the fan and the clatter of heels and distant laughter. Vivian steadied herself at the sink and threaded fingers through her hair. The mirror offered no reflection, only the cool glass that promised a face she could not meet. She remembered the morning light at her parents' home years ago when she had first realized brightness had become a rumor. She had adapted. She had learned the map of the world without sight. But this announcement, this public thing, felt like a fragile bridge. She wanted to cross it whole. She was not alone for long. Voices pressed against the door, close enough that the tile should have caught their footsteps. Two voices. Julian's, low and controlled. Serena's, the color of a scalded laugh. Vivian listened. Her ears laid claim to the different weights of their tones. Julian's with the oily velvet of practiced lying. Serena with an edge of triumph she refused to hide. They spoke in fragments, and Vivian, who had learned to capture the meaning behind noise, pieced them together. "He's already taken care of the signatures," Julian said. "Once we have the certificate, the insurers will start to move. Huo's pull will collapse the share price by the end of next week." "No cameras," Serena said. "No public. We need everyone thinking this was tragic, not suspicious. The will goes the same day. We don't leave room for doubt." Vivian's mouth went dry. Her hand left the cool sink and found the edge. Her fingers curled until the porcelain bit into her skin. She thought of the way their hands had fit together at the cake table, of Julian's palm resting over hers, feigning solidarity. She listened to the way Julian promised and planned. There was a name, Huo. There was the word signatures. There was the hush of someone laughing under their breath, triumphant, cruel. She didn't move. She stayed behind the door, pressed flat against the frame, because it was the only vantage point she had, and because she had learned that the most dangerous thing was not to know where violence would come from. She stayed and let them plan. When they left, their footsteps retreated into the corridor, the sound of a pair of lives sliding into complicity. Julian's shoes passed the restroom doorway, then returned for a moment, as if to check, as if some small tenderness required a second public performance. His hand brushed the doorframe, nearer to her than it had any right to be, and Vivian felt the heat of the skin that had once promised fidelity. It was, she thought, a bell she could not unring. She walked back into the light of the ballroom on a tide of applause, and the world welcomed her as if nothing had happened. The night folded into itself the way a well-managed ledger closes at the end of a quarter. She gave interviews to friends who asked the polite questions and came home to the apartment that smelled faintly of citrus and the faint steam of Julian's shawarma from the night before. They went to bed with the press release already drafts and the future mapped in spreadsheets. Vivian felt an ache in the center of her chest that had nothing to do with the pregnancy, a cold, anticipatory no. She had seen betrayal in other people's lives. Friends who had been quietly undermined, rivals who had been dislodged by the soft scissor of gossip. Still, there was a distinct, heavy quality to betrayal when it came from a hand that had once learned the exact angle of your hairline. That week was a shallow one marked by small disturbances. Her porridge came to room temperature on the counter because Julian had to run to the office. He left his phone face up. She heard the buzz of messages through his briefcase and could feel the breath of other conversations as his eyes skimmed on the screen. A picture, a name she did not know. Serena came by to help with shopping lists, to tidy up her room with the kind of efficient, practiced attention someone gives when staking a claim. The first attempt was the kind that lives in hindsight like a bruise. Vivian woke in the small hours with a razor of nausea and the sensation of heat that pulled across her tongue like a line. Her vision had long given way to memory. She knew the layout of the room by heart. She sat up and reached for the glass of water Julian left by the bed, the one he always left on the nightstand, white ceramic, ring of condensation, because that was the habit of a man who wanted to be seen as caretaker. The porridge was in the kitchen, waiting. She felt foolish thinking of it, the way people think of small betrayals as omens. Within hours, she was in the bathroom again, only this time the world was ragged. She leaned against the sink and felt the cold tile, felt the fear. There were no footprints other than her own, and the set of heels in the hallway. Julian burst in a flurry of words, a mixture of concern and controlled shock. He called the ambulance with a voice that trembled in all the right places. He held her hand and whispered that they would get through it, that he would call the doctors, then he loved her, words repeated like a ritual. They watched over her while she vomited into the porcelain. They watched like the people who invented the script of catastrophe in which they played the part of loving spouse. When the ambulance arrived, Julian's hands were steady in front of the medics, his voice professional now, the practiced cadences of a manager protecting an asset. Serena arrived at the ER like an altar server, eyes wet and a hand pressed to her mouth. She kissed Julian's cheek with an intimacy that pivoted toward appropriation. Vivian recovered slowly enough to step down the stairs again, but quickly enough to be marked in the doctor's notes as food poisoning, cause unknown. Behind the bland medical phrasing, there was a frayed string of explanations Julian insisted on, maybe imported goods, a tainted market batch. He wrote the explanation as a man writing a press statement. Neat, reasonable, sanitized. Serena went home clutching his arm like a reliquary. They both posted condolences online to friends who sent worried messages, and the world nodded with brief, distracted sympathy. The second attempt was more deliberate. They drove that night, under a sky that had the hard, indifferent sheen of a storm about to fracture. Julian had offered to take Vivian to the lake for a walk. Fresh air, he said, clearing your head. He had coffee in the passenger cup holder and a playlist on the stereo that cut to low strings and then static. The road to the lake wound along the river at the edge of the city, a two-lane strip that narrowed suddenly with a shoulder that dropped into the tall reeds. Vivian knew the route by the memorized sequence of curbs and turns her husband had given them for years. She could feel the slight slope as they descended, the way the tires hummed on older asphalt. They argued in the manner that negotiates power rather than feelings. Small words about the anniversary, about the board's expectations, about how Vivian's condition had been a burden that no one had expected. She felt the air change and the lightness in Julian's voice when he said, not quite a joke, that life is easier when there's less to carry. She could not see the way his hand slid from the steering wheel to the middle console and then to his lap. She could not see Serena's reflection in the rearview mirror if she were indeed there. Vivian could only imagine because the sound of another breath was there, the shared, lowered laughter that closes the distance between co-conspirators. The car crossed a small bridge, and then Julian's hands tightened as if controlling the wheel with sudden resolve. There was a slip of a skid, a scream, the sensation that the world tilted. Cold water closed over her face like a fist. The car, the unfortunate gleaming sedan that carried them, capsized, collapsing into the lake with a suddenness that stole breath and sound. The world for Vivian narrowed to two facts. She could not see, and she could not move freely. The pressure of water made it hard to hear. The leather of the seat squealed against the seam as the car rolled like a toy, and then stopped beneath a surface that reflected the city lights like a shattered mirror. Outside, air turned to panic. Julian's voice broke the surface intermittently, and something about the cadence of it did not align with the terror she felt. There were frantic shouts, the crunch of gravel as bystanders ran to the shoreline. Hands reached in and then out, too small and too late. Someone said her name, over and over. They pounded the window until skin reddened, and the lake accepted their sound like a secret. They dragged the wreckage free at dawn. Divers searched the colder, darker reaches of water. Julian stood on the shoreline while they worked, his shirt clinging to his torso and his face white as if he had been drained of color by grief alone. Serena held his arm. Cameras arrived, the cheap, relentless light of new media vans, then moved away again under direction. The divers returned without her body. The official story formed quickly. The car went off the road. The driver, in shock, could not recall the correct sequence of events. No remains were recovered. The police logged the probable drowning as an open case. Friends and family grieved in the way the public does when it needs a narrative, raw, indiscriminate. There were memorial posts and a steady rhythm of candlelight at the lake. Julian and Serena were photographed on the dock, hollow-eyed and holding each other as if to keep the narrative of sorrow plausible. At the apartment, the office, the phones kept ringing. The boardroom put out a statement that was all the distance of corporate grief. The Wen family mourns. The insurer filed its own smooth paragraph about pending investigation. Almost overnight, the machinery of death, papers, signatures, claims, began to move. Julian wrote emails to longtime clients expressing shock and devastation. Serena accepted interviews about a sister taken too soon, the camera close to her face, her voice a public pitch of sorrow threaded with secret satisfaction. Vivian was declared dead before the water had finished settling. An autopsy report, technically a formality because no body had been recovered, allowed for a declaration under certain legal presumptions. Because she had been found in a submerged vehicle and missing for the statutory period, the paperwork that men like Julian and lawyers liked, neat, straight, decisive, was ready. A death certificate materialized like a contract gone through to its last lawful page. There were ashes too, legal protocol, an image of closure for a world that wanted something tidy to dispose of. The family held a funeral. People spoke about what she had built, what she had meant. They said the right names. The flowers took picture-perfect shapes in the oblong room. The takeover was mechanical and immediate. In the quiet that follows a headline, predators smell opportunity. Julian and Serena, who had planned for an absence, stepped into roles with the ease of practiced claimants. Julian as the grieving widower who would guide the company through transition. Serena as the sister who would honor the legacy and manage domestic affairs. They arrived at the company in the following days with a face of exhausted competence, and the board, afraid of instability and eager to keep revenue streams intact, offered them thinly veiled control. The Huo Group, one of Wen Group's largest clients, announced a pause on their ongoing negotiations. Their statement was careful. Pending leadership confirmation. The stock market listened and decided that the safest investment was to pull away until the fog of rumor cleared. Spike, the sort of man who wears practical leather and speaks in the sort of monosyllables you feel against the ribs, was not swayed by grief. He called Julian twice in 72 hours, once to remind him of debts, and then again to remind him of collateral. There were photographs of a man in a dark coat in places no one meant him to be, outside the Wen offices, leaning against a lamppost as if waiting for a meeting. Julian's voice, once satisfied to orchestrate charm, carried the shadow of fear now. The men who do violence for money prefer straightforward accounts. Pay what you owe or someone else fills the blanks. Julian and Serena moved fast. The will was read in a small corporate office rather than in a sunlit drawing room. Formal deeds shifted, signatures were witnessed, the insurers issued provisional payments. They took every step like magpies, collecting everything shiny and inside the legal gray. They made public gestures of gratitude towards supporters and partners who had helped them through the terrible evening. They posted photographs with arms wrapped around each other that looked, to a camera, like consolation. Outside, the press smelled cheat and the world sang along. Social media accounts reconstituted the narrative with the speed of comfortable assumptions. A beloved CEO tragically gone, a grieving husband and helpful sister left to carry her work. There were pieces about a brilliant leader cut short, and then, under those pieces, the forensic attentions of the curious. A neighbor's tweet about a late-night argument, a cab driver's vague recollection of a woman's voice, the faint possibility of video at a petrol station that showed a car with 2 occupants. The internet is patient that way. It assembles shapes without proper context and calls them truth. Julian and Serena moved like quick hands, choosing which photographs to publicize and which to suppress. Vivian's office, cleared by the administrative staff, became a kind of shrine to paper. Soft copies of strategy plans sat on encrypted servers that required fingerprint scans Julian did not have. Contracts moved, legal counsel appeared, and the board authorized emergency measures to stabilize market perceptions. Wen Group's stock took a predictable dip. Investors are animals with short memories and long fears. But it was the Huo Group's announcement that pinched the company hardest. Their negotiations, sensitive to leadership stability, pulled back. A cascade began. A key supplier paused. An international order froze pending confirmation. The narrative was a rope around the financial neck of Wen Group. Inside the apartment Julian and Serena shared now with the quiet of structure, the relief settled like a domestic dust. They sat late into the night over documents. There was a ledger open, lines of figures that turned in predictable ways when the ashes of a person are recorded as assets and liabilities. Julian's face, which had been so practiced in the light of public pity, hardened with numbers. Serena leaned over his shoulder and pointed at a clause in the insurance policy, one of the clauses she knew by rote because she had expected to need them sooner rather than later. Their triumph tasted of champagne, of the adrenaline that follows a well-timed coup. But advantage breeds mistakes. Arrogance slackens vigilance. They told friends in the wrong rooms, shared confidences that were meant to be private, and laughed in ways that did not belong in the shadow of loss. Spike, who liked pressure as an economy unto itself, started to make more insistent calls. "Move some of the liquid," he advised Julian through a voice that sounded like a rusted hinge. "You're short. We can't hold forever." Julian paced the living room like a man with his shirt untucked for the first time in a life of tight collars. He promised, in the quiet of the night, to take care of it. He promised, and then promised again, until promises were an echo. Outside, the obituary notice consolidated the narrative. Vivian Wen, CEO, philanthropic leader, tragically drowned. The funeral was set for the week when the lake had been coldest and the air held the smell of damp leaves. Old friends came, clients came, some came with checks folded into envelopes. There were bells at the chapel and a sermon that spoke of the unpredictable nature of fortune and of the need to cherish what remained. At the chapel, Julian took the podium with a trembling voice that had been rehearsed and an arm around Serena that looked both supportive and strategic. He spoke of partnership and dreams. He spoke of the unborn child Vivian had carried. He placed his hands over the casket as if to anchor it, to own it, even though the casket's lid had been shut by a series of legal decisions that felt like finality. In the back of the chapel, a woman in a plain coat watched everything with the blunt attention of someone who had come to measure the world by how it hurt. She was, in the eyes of some, a grieving friend. To others, she was another woman whose life the town's moneyed gossip would soon file with the rest of the small tragedies. No one noticed the way she lingered at the edges or the small sound she made when the priest spoke of the certainty of rest. If anyone had watched closely enough for the little things, they might have seen her fingers, thin, pale, turning an old photograph over and over in her pocket until the edges wore soft. By the time the hymn swelled, Julian and Serena were already at work. There were signatures to be coaxed from hesitant trustees and assets to be compartmentalized. The company's legal counsel arrived the next morning, carrying suitcases of paper in which were nested contingency plans for a world in which a leader disappears and convenience assumes a new face. The Huo Group board, seeing the vacuum, delayed their final approval and left the space between them and Wen Group like an unpaid balance. Analysts typed their emissions into columns and called it uncertainty. Traders closed positions, and the market responded with the calm cruelty of math. Nobody asked the right questions about the scratches on the car's rear door or the contents of Julian's overnight bag. Nobody asked why a simple list of contacts appeared to have been scrubbed of certain names. It takes courage to notice a pattern, and it takes longer to stitch that courage to action. There were, nonetheless, those who smelled untruth. A freelance journalist dug up small anomalies and placed them as questions beneath the obituaries. A neighbor's surveillance camera, mostly used for their cat, had a shadowy frame that might have shown another vehicle that night. But questions are only dangerous when someone has the patience to follow them. The corporate tide was bigger, more persuasive, and it smoothed rough edges with the efficiency of lawyers. Julian's position within Wen Group strengthened even as his personal world cracked. He held emergency board meetings with the same eloquence he had used to secure a loan for Violet Manor 5 years prior. He promised a stabilizing strategy. He appointed himself interim chairman in a vote that was near unanimous. Many directors were tired or fearful, and fear makes people compliant. Serena sat on the advisory committee with the kind of confident gaze that suggested she would take on any household crisis imaginable. Publicly grieving sister, privately an eager architect of a new order. In the corridor outside Vivian's office, a junior analyst named Chen, Director Chen, sat with a packet of drafts and flicked through them like a worried moth. He was the sort of man who believed in the company's original mission, not merely profits, but stewardship. He had worked with Vivian for years and had watched her perform leadership in small, exacting ways that were not always seen on profit and loss statements. He sent a single email to her personal address, asking only if there were any personal notes she would want kept confidential for the estate. No one opened the email for Vivian. The account, in the legal transition, had been sealed by court order. At home, Julian slept in a bed that smelled of white linens and new plots. He had a phone buzzing with voices, Spike's impatience, a banker's mild rebuke, a lawyer's dry recommendations. He would return calls, promise concessions, and then do the thing he had always done best, charm his way through the first round of obstacles and buy himself more time to weave the second. Serena, meanwhile, catalogued the final details of what she had always told herself she deserved. Her nights were lit by the glow of a laptop screen and the parchment of a will. She told herself this was not cruel. It was the only way to claim a life she had imagined was due to her. She had been patient with anger and jealous of luck since childhood. Tonight, she would buy a dress 2 sizes smaller than her body demanded and build a smile at the mirror that said, "I am a proper mourner." Nobody noticed the small thing in the lilies arrangement at the chapel, a smear of water on a photograph where the reflection caught the wrong light, a small, almost invisible anomaly that a less frantic person might later recall as proof of nothing at all. In tragedy, the world favors those who tell the biggest stories. Julian and Serena were fluent in the language of big stories. After the funeral, there were 2 ceremonies, the public one for cameras and the private one that included the legal formalities. The insurance claim form, once initiated, began to move through a series of polite, efficient hands. Policies were nudged forward, and a clause about miscarriage versus death payout, language cold enough to stop a heartbeat, was cited quietly in a conversation Julian had with a company lawyer. The announcement put forward to shareholders the delicate balance, the infant, the legacy, the responsibility. The word that haunted the room was compensation, soft and technical, like the name of a weather. On the third night, as Julian signed a paper that would authorize an immediate transfer to a contingency fund, someone knocked on the apartment door. It was Spike, standing under the light with the rain making his face glisten. He had the sort of smile that didn't come from kindness. "You know I don't like waiting," he said. "You know what happens to people who wait." Julian's hands were steady. He promised, he pledged. He told Spike he had papers moving, transfers scheduled. He handed Spike a number that was not nothing but still short of what Spike wanted. Spike took the number, folded it, and put it in his pocket. He told Julian he would come back in a week. When Spike left, Serena took a breath that was almost an intake of triumph. Julian went to the window and watched the river, thinking about the bank accounts and labeled boxes he had to touch in the morning. He had on a tie that did not quite match the shirt. He felt the lights of the city like the headlights of a future that had been arranged by other people too clever for him. He shifted, impatient, toward the work. No one stopped to imagine what it would feel like on the other side, of being presumed dead, of being turned from a living woman into a set of claims and a legal portfolio. No one imagined the quiet inside a woman who was declared absent by law, while perhaps still listening, still counting the degrees of the betrayal. The world had a taste for tidy endings. Julian and Serena were experts at writing them. But the world also tends to hide corners where sound collects, where things that seem small, an overheard name, a thrown-away receipt, collect like lint. In those corners, a pattern waits to be seen. There were, in the following week, a few small anomalies. A door left unlocked at the lakeside storage shed. A voicemail on a private line that ended as if the speaker had been interrupted. A neighbor who swore they had seen a figure walking along the shore the morning the car had sunk, someone bundled in a coat with their head bent low. The police took statements and filed them under unverified. At the wake, Serena leaned in close to Julian and whispered, "We did it. We did what we had to." He nodded, and for a second a warmth threaded through his chest that was a kind of triumph and a kind of fear. They told each other, now a unit, a team. They would steer the company. They would claim the child's insurance, the assets. They would keep the public story tidy. Outside, the city swallowed the sound of their conversation and moved on to a new commercial. Huo Group released a terse statement that read like a vehicle backing away from fire. "We remain committed to our partners," it said, "but require a confirmed leadership structure. We will withhold further engagements until a full review is complete." The markets shivered and slid. Investors recalibrated. The phone lines in Wen Group filled with calls that were not always polite. And in a small hospital on the edge of the city, hidden by the fact that people rarely notice corners unless they are forced to, a nurse found an abandoned bag behind a bush near the creek. Inside was a photograph of Vivian, one where she smiled with teeth, the hospital band still looped around the wrist of someone else. The nurse took it, and for reasons that had nothing to do with heroism, slid it into a drawer that later someone would open and glance at only once. It became, for a moment, a small pulsing breadcrumb in a forest that Julian and Serena had believed themselves to have torched behind them. When the casket was lowered and the dirt hit wood with that soft, inevitable thud, Julian put his hand on Serena's back and watched the people cluster like gulls dispersing. He felt the relief of a job well done, and the peculiar ache of a man who hears the echo of his own lies. He had swapped a life for power. He had placed himself at the center of a map that, in the raw light of day, might well strip him of the very things he had promised to secure. No one could say yet that the story had run its course. Paper can be altered. People who believed themselves invulnerable sometimes forgot how precarious the scaffold of collusion truly is. And somewhere, between a trash-strewn parking lot and a shuttered lakeside pier, between the gentle clink of cutlery at a wake and the hum of an empty server room, small evidence began to gather. Silent, patient, like dust for the first time noticing how it collects. If this story is gripping you, subscribe to follow the full unraveling of what comes after a promise is broken and a fate is presumed. She woke to the smell of disinfectant and the tidiness of a room that had been arranged by someone who knew how to keep secrets. For a moment, only a moment, she let herself imagine that the world had corrected itself. There would be a knock, and Julian would be on the other side of the door, breathless with apology and molten with relief. Then habit returned, the memory of water closing over her face, the sudden animal fight for air, hands that had failed to be hands at the precise instant she needed them. The room kept its own neutrality. A folded blanket lay across the foot of the bed. A cup with no label sat on the nightstand. The window overlooked a service alley, not the river. She had been in this room for weeks. She had been told that time had stalled, and that pain would dull, and she had learned in hospital corridors how to measure progress in small, merciless increments. Her sight, she had assumed the word would feel like an offer, returned in the way electricity returns to a dark theater. Not all at once, not a miracle, but as a series of careful reconnections. At first it was a blur, the world in oil and shadow, then edges sharpened, a seam on the blanket, a crack in the paint where water had rusted the lath, a smudge that, with concentration, turned into a face. She practiced opening and closing her eyes as if they were muscles, small defiance that tasted like control. No one handed her miracles. She earned each slant of light. When she first focused on the window and saw with slow, impossible clarity the rusted fire escape and the pigeon pecking at a wrapper, the sensation was that of a theft reversed. She did not cry. Tears had become a resource she rationed. Instead, she catalogued what came back to her: color, contrast, the pale scar near her left temple she had never before noticed, the depth of shadow under the lamp, the way the plastic cup reflected a dull white. A man came in with no fanfare. He moved like someone who had learned the particular manner of approaching without making sudden gestures. Director Chen, whom she had seen for years pacing between meeting rooms and clients with a stubborn, dry faith in the work. He wore a sweater despite the heat outside, and he had the sort of face that aged by increments of careful skepticism. He sat at the edge of the bed and did not ask too many questions. He produced a thermos and a pair of sunglasses, and the two of them arranged the room into practical spaces: conversation, medication, plans. "We thought you were gone," he said finally, as if articulating a truth that had been too weighty to bear. Vivian searched his expression until she made it a map. "You let them say I was dead." "No choice then," Chen replied, the words flat. "You had to be gone, legally. It gave us the silence we needed to work. You came back when we could make sure they couldn't kill you again." Alive then, not freed, not safe, but alive. The word fit in her mouth like something she had to taste before it became instruction. She thought of the funeral, the softened faces, the ledger lines that had already been drawn over her life. She thought of Julian's practiced grief and Serena's public heartbreak, their hands in each other's hair like a quiet negotiation. She felt the old verities, love, betrayal, slide into place as reasons the world had bent against her. It would be simpler to rage, and sometimes she let herself move in that direction, a hot vengeance that would have made him flinch. But rage was a poor architect. It left jagged edges and burns. She had been trained to make evidence cling to the bone of a story, to build an argument so inevitable that even the loudest liar could not remake history. She had lived her professional life persuading boards and regulators with numbers and signatures. Now she repurposed that training into a private thing, a campaign to make the world see. Ethan, he preferred the first name to any formal title, came next, bringing with him a steadiness that was not sentimental but pragmatic. He had been distant before, a client whose accounts straddled 2 continents and who had learned the language of deals. He had reasons to be careful. He also had reasons to be kindly. Where Director Chen offered institutional memory, Ethan offered muscle in the holes of business and an angle that got to the heart of what Julian and Serena had tried to steal: reputation, contracts, and the raw mobility of capital. "You should not have shown yourself," Ethan said the first evening he visited. He had an accent that was spare and efficient. "They will eat any crack in your story. This is not a purse you unseal." "I was declared dead," Vivian said. "They built a life on my silence." "And they will continue building unless you dismantle it from inside their comfort." He folded his hands with a lawyer's patience. "You don't have to stage theatrics. You have to collect the undeniable." That phrase, the undeniable, became their shorthand. They would not invent evidence. They would coax truth into being apparent. They would not endanger people or recreate catastrophes. Their tactics were slow, precise, legal, an exposure of the seams that made the whole lie hold. In the weeks that followed, Vivian rehearsed every part of the performance she would need to play. The blind widow whose presence, when required, was like a ghost. She would use it as camouflage. She would move among the living without being recognized, her face altered by shadow and hair, and an insistence on being quieter than the world expected. She never allowed pity to cloud her judgment. She needed Julian to underestimate her, to assume nothing had been left for her to do. The first public moment she engineered was small and stupidly simple, an invitation to the luncheon hosted by a charity that both she and the company supported. Julian did not expect her to attend. He expected grief to remain performative, a ritual of distance where perhaps he would find a sympathetic hand or a sentience he could buy into. But she arrived, a silhouette under a hat, and sat at the back of the room with sunglasses on, appearing as a woman who could not see the room's faces. Serena drifted through the reception like a bright moth. Julian followed. They did not notice the woman at the back. People moved around them. A cameraman from a small tabloid drifted by. His lens liked surface stories, and Julian and Serena fed him one. Their laughter over private jokes, Serena arranging Julian's tie, Julian's hand finding the small pocket where a phone had been slipped. The camera took frames they thought harmless. A microphone caught Serena's voice in its offhand way, a line about closing the accounts and making sure the child has everything, a laugh that clipped the end of the sentence. Vivian, half hidden, listened with an attention that was surgical. Those frames mattered. Ethan secured the raw footage that would later be crucial. Public, unguarded moments where intent could be inferred from action, where hands and tones spoke louder than rehearsed grief. With Director Chen's access to company servers and a compliant junior in legal, they assembled files that did not need theory to matter. Emails with missing timestamps, ledgers with blanked entries, travel receipts that contradicted sworn testimony. They did not rush to the police. The law, Vivian had learned, is an instrument that works best with evidence already gathered and then offered in a way that suggests a pattern rather than a single point. Panic makes police sloppy. Method makes them meticulous. Vivian intended to make the police meticulous. The most dangerous man in Julian's orbit was Spike. He was not sentimental, he was mercenary and patient. Spike's calls resumed in waves. He wanted money, he wanted movement. Julian, drunk on the idea of entitlement, gave him fragments, promises that looked plausible on paper, but whose liquidity was a fantasy. Spike grew impatient. "You can't live on promises in my world," he said when he finally cornered Julian in a private meeting room. He leaned forward, and Julian's charm, always so useful at banquets and shareholders' gatherings, looked like an inadequate flashlight against Spike's dark. Julian, up to his neck in obligations he had hidden through careless accounting and confident lies, did the thing he had always done best. He tried to persuade. Persuasion is a delicate currency. It requires an audience that believes there will be a future payout. Julian offered Spike collateral, names of accounts, the suggestion of liquidity that, to the untrained eye, might have been sufficient. Spike snarled and deferred judgment. On paper, all men with weapons and names deferred, but his patience was finite. Vivian let the pressure on Julian become a visible fact in their circles. Ethan and Director Chen ensured that the rumor mill had its proper steadying and destabilizing effect. They leaked precise, careful questions to analysts and to friendly journalists. Why had Huo paused their negotiations? Why was the credit line frozen? Small, sober suggestions that got behind reputational veils and made clients nervous. Huo Group, a company that moved like water over markets, was amenable to certainty. Where certainty failed, Huo pulled away. And yet there was the soft pivot. Huo could be returned if leadership were stable and if proof emerged that the company's stewardship was honest. Vivian and Ethan began to shape that path. They would need Huo to return publicly at the right moment, to anchor investor confidence, to show a bridge from chaos to governance. But first, evidence. Teamwork was practical. Director Chen supplied internal documents. A junior auditor who had always admired Vivian slipped over an encrypted thumb drive one night and left it in an innocuous folder at the office. Ethan maneuvered business channels to request a review of a long-standing contract. And when the Huo negotiators asked for clarity, he supplied the possibilities in a way that made them look at the right lines. Vivian, for her part, rehearsed the look of vulnerability and the precise, sharp concentration of a woman who could not see but could, if necessary, hear a pin drop from the other side of a ballroom. One of the most potent pieces of evidence came from Julian himself. He was careless with his triumphs. In a private moment of triumph, aftermath of a board meeting where he had flexed newly won authority, he allowed himself to be recorded by a handheld device by a woman he did not know existed. The woman, a temp brought into accounts to avoid suspicion, had the face of youth and the steadiness of someone who had watched too many things snapped out of place. She recorded, with no more technique than a fingertip, Julian bragging about the arrangement, how certain clauses had been smoothed over, how the insurers had been advised to expect a straightforward payout, how a miscarriage clause could be argued with the right coroner's interpretation. The recording was blunt and ugly and irrefutable for its tone. Vivian heard it twice. She did not cry. She catalogued the cleft in Julian's voice as evidence of a man who had equated power with ownership of grief. She let the recording sink into the network of proof they were building. The first deliberate public bait, the one that would make Julian mistake arrogance for impunity, came during a shareholders' luncheon. Vivian decided she would appear as herself, but in the way a ghost appears at a wake, at the edges, eyes shielded, voice soft. She sat in the meeting room at the back with a cane, not for balance but as a prop to carry the image she wanted the world to hold. The helpless victim, sightless and returned like an echo. Julian arrived with Serena at his side, both gleaming with relief. He owned the room with a practiced smile and a hand that had learned to turn loyalties into bookkeeping entries. Serena sat near him, and the two of them whispered through course after course. Julian laughed in a way he thought disarming. He did not notice the woman at the back because Julian had made himself invisible to things that did not feed his ego. He did notice later that the woman in the back had a way of tilting her head that suggested she was listening. He misread it as a soft confusion and allowed himself to be charming in her direction, as men do when they believe they are comforting the wounded. He made the mistake of being human in the wrong way. When Serena moved closer, under the pretense of adjusting his collar, touching him with the intimacy of conspirators who share a commodity, Vivian let her eyes rest on them through the slats where sunglasses met skin. She let the world be described to her. She allowed the flirtation to unfurl not as endurance, but as an instrument. She arranged for an allied cameraman, one of Ethan's people, to have a clear line. A long lens that could capture hands, smiles, the private gestures that betray intent. The footage, edited by day into a short montage of gestures sent to the right journalists, would not be salacious. It would be legal, proof of an intimacy that undercut their rehearsed narratives of grief. That flirtation, performed and recorded, became the fulcrum. Julian's arrogance fed the evidence. He continued, in other spaces, the office elevator, private dinners, believing he was invisible. He was not. As their trap tightened, Julian's mistakes multiplied. He began diverting company funds into shadow accounts to appease Spike, and he authorized transfers that on paper could be explained as routine but, with forensic accounting, were clearly anomalous. He asked for sign-offs from people whose signatures did not appear on file. He tried to bribe a low-level compliance officer with a trip and a promise. The man refused and turned to Director Chen with suspicion. His calls to Spike became apologies and then threats. Spike's patience thinned. He was a man who liked the economy of certainty. Pay now or the cost will be higher. Julian, flush with the idea that his claim on everything was secure, delayed. He possessed in his mind a resignation letter already written for the world. He had not anticipated the ferocious, methodical return of someone who had been declared dead. When the insurance company initiated its final payment, Vivian's allies had already set the counterweight. An independent auditor, a firm with power but not loyalty, received an anonymous tip containing the temp's recording, internal bank statements, and a plaintive, evidence-dense letter. The auditors asked questions that could not be shrugged off with grief. Julian's explanation, he had been ensuring liquidity, sounded thin in the line of a man whose upbringing taught him to use charm as a financial instrument. The claims adjuster pushed for documentation. The documents Julian now offered bore the kind of mistakes men make when they fabricate. Mismatched timestamps, duplicated approvals that suggested human manipulation rather than seamless automation. The press began to taste weakness. A journalist who had been friendly with Vivian in other years took the time to visit a source in Huo's offices. Huo Group, it turned out, had been worried all along. They had frozen the account. They had worried that the leadership vacuum was a liability. 2 of their board members had whisper-conferred about retrenching. They liked the idea of association with Wen Group, but not with scandal. Ethan reached out at the right time with a graceful public proposal. Let Huo recommit under a clearly defined stewardship plan. Huo was cautious and demanded proofs of governance. In return for public assurance of structural reforms and the removal of those implicated in the fraud, Huo agreed to re-engage. That re-engagement was pivotal. Market confidence returned, not because the truth had been fully aired, but because a major client, the kind of client whose silence had tilted the stock downward, had promised to re-enter negotiations. Investors read the promise as a pathway to stability. The stock's upward tick did not matter as much as the optics. Vivian's allies had engineered the optics by pushing the right documents to Huo's legal team and by offering a framework of corporate reform that included outside auditors and a non-voting advisory council. Huo's concession could be presented as salvation if, in the same breath, the company publicly excised the rot. Vivian timed her own reveal to coincide with that re-engagement. She convened a small press conference under the guise of a philanthropic announcement. She made it seem like a healing gesture. The room was full of cameras and the kind of breathless anticipation that follows a small miracle. Julian sat in the front row, chest puffed with the kind of self-satisfaction that comes from believing you have won. She walked to the podium with the deliberate, quiet dignity of someone who had rehearsed the weight of air. Her sunglasses lay on the table before her, like the evidence of a costume she no longer needed. She did not take them up. She spoke of loss with the measured cadence of someone who did not want to be pitied. She spoke of the company's responsibilities, and then, mundane and devastatingly effective, she said, "There is new evidence that requires a full independent investigation." Julian's face, in the close-ups on the live feed, changed like a barometer. He had expected gratitude. He had not expected scrutiny. Humans are like houses in storms. The facade holds while the interior is sometimes aflame. Cameras found the flame. The independent investigation was not a spectacle of revenge. It was, by design, thorough. Police came with warrants after preliminary reviews suggested insurance fraud and suspected attempt to harm. The temp's recording, the auditor's files, the anomalies in bank transfers, and the timeline of their rehearsed grief formed a pattern. Motive, opportunity, and falsified documents. Arresting Julian was not cinematic in the way film staged it. There was no dramatic clatter of cuffs at a gala. It was quieter. A knock at the door, the polite tone of officers trained to avoid chaos, and Julian's face turning from white to the sick, honest pallor of a man who had miscalculated his immunity. Serena screamed, at first at the injustice, and then at the loss of a game she had thought she would win. Spike watched from the sidelines with a face of contracted interest. His threats, now turned into demands for recompense, could not be answered by charm. Courtroom proceedings followed the slow, merciless arithmetic of justice. Charges were read: insurance fraud, conspiracy, embezzlement, attempted homicide, high-level phrases that carried weight without the nitty-gritty of procedure. Julian's arraignment made no romance of the man he had been. He became to cameras the prototype of someone whose greed had metastasized into criminality. Serena, implicated through emails and her presence in orchestrated moments, faced charges that would not absolve her with tears. There was no single public spectacle that delivered the coup. Instead, there were a series of legal and financial blows that together left Julian hollowed and then bankrupt. The court froze assets pending investigation, bank accounts, transferabilities, property deeds that had something of the sheen of their owners' arrogance. Lenders called in their debts. Spike, suddenly faced with the collapse of his hoped-for collateral, turned his gaze inwards. Men like him prefer settlements over spectacle. He wanted money, not moralizing headlines. With the assets frozen and the insurers refusing payout because of the emerging fraudulent behavior, the hole Julian had dug for himself broadened into a gulf. Vivian watched some of this from the courtroom spectators' bench, across an aisle that contained press and a circle of the curious. She had the odd sensation of watching a slow-motion collapse. The man who had stolen so much dignity now discovered that money is not armor. There were moments when Julian met her eyes across the room and sought mercy, but what he found in response was a collected, steady woman who had decided her life would not be a stage for his repentance. Serena's fall was more public and cruelly theatrical. Her interviews that had been polished and prepared suddenly read as performance when juxtaposed with the temp's recording and the paper trail. She tried to craft new narratives, plausible deniability, ignorance, but the evidence rendered those defenses thin. Where Julian had relied on bravado, Serena had depended on a certain entitlement that made her sloppy. She had said too much in private rooms. Prosecutors, steady and deft, used the transcripts and the emails to show an architecture of conspiracy. The courtroom found its rhythm with the story Vivian's team had assembled, and by the time judges convened to set bail and freeze assets, Julian and Serena's options were narrowed. The company's recovery had to be more than punitive. It had to be constructive. Vivian did not return to Wen Group as a woman seeking vengeance, but as one seeking repair. She had support from Ethan and Huo Group, which agreed to an oversight structure that would protect the company from collapse while a new leadership model was established. Investors found comfort in the plan and slowly returned. Contracts previously on hold resumed. Revenues that had been threatened by panic stabilized. The stock ticked upward, not because the damage was erased, but because the architecture of governance suggested something different: accountability. The insurance companies recalibrated their claims in light of newly revealed fraud. The payout that Julian had expected vanished under the weight of anomalies. Where there had been an expected liquidity, there was now litigation. The public learned the facts gradually and with fascination. They watched a man collapse under the logic of his own decisions. Spike had less patience for legal systems. He was a man who understood practicalities. Debts required immediate satisfaction. He did not wait for courts. He called in the debts he had been owed, and when the money was not forthcoming, he took measures to ensure Julian felt the squeeze. It was not theatrics on his part. It was the compression of a man who had no patience for philosophical explanations of law. The net effect was swift. Properties were listed, bank accounts were frozen by creditor claims, and the collateral Julian had promised was seized in a rational, unsentimental exercise of collection. He became a man of fewer options. Where once he had been able to command favors with a smile, he now found doors closed. In the quiet aftermath, Vivian did what she had always done, rebuilt with care. She refused to be defined by the trauma. She presided over board meetings with the clarity of someone who had seen both the worst and the possibility. She instituted reforms, external audits, fresh compliance officers, policies that would limit the ability of any single executive to manipulate accounts without oversight. She met with staff individually, quietly, the way a leader helps repair trust by touching the daily mechanics of a company. She did not return to the private life she had been promised. She refused to be anyone's consolation prize. She reclaimed the role she had once occupied not because she wanted authority for its own sake, but because she recognized the corporate responsibility to the employees and the clients who depended on a stable Wen Group. The rescue was not triumphant in the cinematic sense, it was steady. Huo's public statement of renewed partnership was accompanied by direct oversight and the condition that Vivian herself be part of the transition committee. Personal life, which is always messy, resolved itself in an unostentatious way. Ethan, who had been a presence on the periphery of the legal battle, became a companion in the slow, unglamorous work of healing. There was no sudden felicity, no cinematic embrace. Instead, there were long walks, conversations about books and contracts, and the odd injustices of the world. He had watched her not as a trophy, but as a co-conspirator in the good sense of the word, someone who helped her make the right choices. Serena faced a different path. Arrested and tried, she learned the cost of her choices in a small institutional cell. Theirs had been a collusion of intimacy and greed. She lost the thing she had wanted most: status, freedom, the idea that a sister's grief could be bought. There were moments of remorse, but remorse does not always match restitution. The law took its course. The public that had once cheered her empathetic photographs later cheered at the fairness of accountability, always a strange theater. Julian was left to reckon with the ruin of his choices. He had been clever at inventing excuses. He was less clever at living without the currency that had lubricated his life. The asset freezes, the creditor claims, the refusal of insurers to pay out. These combined until he had nothing left that could be sold to settle his debts. Spike's patience, even if frayed, had limits. The man had been practical enough to extract what the law allowed. Julian found himself without funds, without friends who had not asked questions earlier, and finally with a conscience that was quietly, painfully present. He was not punished for being human. He was undone for monetizing betrayal. There was one moment, late in the legal process, when Julian attempted to approach Vivian. He found himself outside the glass atrium of the company building, staring at a woman who moved with a light he had not seen before. She walked with a precision that belonged to someone who had claimed back a map of her life. He called out to her, voice breaking with a mixture of pleading and calculation, and she, without turning, continued. He forced his way inside, breathless and hollowed. There was an exchange in an anteroom, a few words that felt like currency being exchanged too late. He asked for something he could not have. Forgiveness, perhaps, or the alleviation of his shame. She listened, the way a judge might listen to a sentence read aloud. She did not close the door rudely. She did not lash out. She offered instead a quiet statement. "This is not about what you wanted," she said. Her voice was devoid of the venom that once threatened to unmake him. "It is about what you did." It was not a lesson he could afford to ignore. He had been the architect of his own ruin. He learned, in the slow teacher of legal consequence, that money can buy many things, but that some contracts, those between trust and family, are fragile beyond repair. Vivian did something for herself that was small and devastatingly clean. She walked away, not in the sense of abandonment, but in the sense that she refused to be bound to a past that had been weaponized against her. She signed the necessary paperwork to settle the company's affairs with Huo's oversight. She accepted a modest severance that compensated for the breach he had engineered, but was not a victory trophy. She took her role in the new plan as a steward while she prepared to step aside. On the last day she stepped into the boardroom, as a woman who had gathered back the things she had been given and had taken the ones she had not. The room had been rearranged by people who had seen the moral arithmetic of damage and repair and decided on a course of steadiness. She addressed the board and the staff not with rancor but with practical plans for the future and a public outline of the guardrails she had installed. Cameras gathered like silent witnesses when the statements were released. The public watched the arc of a woman who had been declared dead and had proceeded to put the city on notice. Then she walked. Not in a gust of drama, but with the measured step of someone who had accepted that her life would never be the script she had once had in mind. She left the keys, symbolic and legal, in the hands of the people she trusted. She did not give him the satisfaction of a final scene. She denied him the cruelty of seeing her reduced to his spectacle. She took the decision and made it hers. The man who had once worn charm-like armor sat on a bench outside the courthouse, a figure diminished. He had been forced to account for his deeds, not merely in the court of public opinion, but in a real ledger, debts unpaid, assets taken, promises unfulfilled. He had, in the end, no more than the regret of a man who had thought himself invulnerable and discovered the particular emptiness of a ruined credit line and a ruined name. Vivian moved forward. Her relationship with Ethan was not a rescue. It was a mutual decision to exist with integrity. They did not write a future of gloss and triumph. They negotiated evenings and travel, and the slow, practical work of rebuilding houses without rotten foundations. She planted things, small gestures like new chairs, and endorsed contracts that valued employees, and re-established trust with the suppliers who had nearly abandoned Wen Group when rumors swelled. She became, in the way that matters, present. She thought often, in quiet hours, of the child she had lost. The miscarriage remained a small, consolidated grief, one that did not seek drama. She honored that tiny life not with grand statements, but with choices that made the world safer for people who would follow. A better paid staff, policies that protected women in her company, a fund in the child's name that would support mothers in precarious positions. Grief did not leave the room, but it stopped being a weaponized thing and instead became a source for philanthropic discipline. When reporters later asked about the moral of the story, about revenge or justice, Vivian only said what she had always thought, that justice is not the same as victory. Justice is measured in the restoration of order, in the protection of the vulnerable, in changing systems that enabled greedy behavior. She refused to make a spectacle of her suffering. She had seen how spectacle bleeds the private for public consumption. Instead, she let the legal process do its work, let time heal small wounds, and moved her life in a direction that was not reactive. Julian's bankruptcy was not melodramatic. It was arithmetic, properties liquidated, accounts emptied, the collapse of the social network that had been built on advantages. He found men like Spike closing in with demands and once benefactors unwilling to extend further credit. He had mismanaged charm. It had never been a dependable investment. There was no single humiliating image the press could deliver to finally crush him. The slow erosion of privilege served that purpose better. A man who had believed himself unassailable discovered he was mortal in the strict accounting of debts and consequences. There were court scenes in which Vivian sat and listened without making indulgent faces. There were lawyers who approached her afterwards and thanked her for sparing them spectacle. There were board meetings where she drew lines and then took a step back. She did not humiliate, she corrected. She did not seek revenge, but rather recalibration. When the final legal files closed and the last of Julian's assets were reassigned to pay debts and compensations, Vivian found herself in an office with glass that faced east. The morning she left Wen Group was not punctuated by photographers. She stepped out in a coat that hid nothing and revealed nothing. She walked across a small square, a city that hummed with the usual bright indifference of commerce and anonymity, and she felt something like a door closing. Someone later wrote that she had staged an act of genius. Others called it patience. She called it choosing the right instruments. She had pretended to be blind because it was the clearest way to watch what the world did without her in it. She let him flirt with his mistress because she wanted the moment of arrogance to be captured, because evidence wants witnesses, because the most vulnerable position can be the most powerful when it is chosen. He lost everything he had tried to take. He went to prison for his part in the conspiracy. Serena's sentence was also meted out. Spike received payments as his business dictated, though his gains had been far smaller than he had hoped. The company, under a framework of restored governance, survived. Vivian did not re-weaponize her pain into spectacle. She turned it into policies and scholarships and a quiet attention to the people who had been harmed. The Child's Fund opened quietly and began to make modest payments to mothers in need. A new life arrived, not as a finale, but as an ongoing practice. With Ethan, she found a companion whose steadiness matched her own resolve. They did not marry in a feverish rush. They made a choice one afternoon to buy a small house outside the city with a window that caught the light. It was not ostentatious. It was sensible. They planted a tree on the small slope out front and watched it take root. On the day the last asset was officially recorded as seized from Julian and applied to debts, Vivian walked by the courthouse. She saw him through the barred window of a visitor's room, a pale figure who had once been all warmth and charm, and now was reduced to a smaller man with narrower shoulders. He sat with his hands folded on his knees and looked up when she passed. He wanted something, pity perhaps, absolution maybe. She told herself she had no obligation to give him either. She kept walking. Outside, the air smelled of rain and the city's distant traffic. She felt, in the simple continuity of her feet on pavement, the quiet satisfaction of having dismantled a plan that could have hollowed her life. She felt the smallness of triumph and the weight of the losses she had endured. She allowed herself to feel both. She had been robbed of much. She had reclaimed more. He was broke. He was also accountable. That combination, she thought, was the central lesson. Money had once been his method of control. Now it was the measure of his undoing. Vivian found, in the slow work that followed, that walking away was not an abdication but a claim on herself, on the life she would build on different terms. She did not avenge with blood. She used law and light and careful allies to bring down a fraud. She remained humane and exacting and, in the end, free from the man who had thought himself her owner. She stood, once, in the window of her new office, a modest room with a small view of the river, and watched the water move. The world would always be complicated, its currents willing to pull a person under. She had been under before and had come back up with a knowledge that saved her. The sight she had regained allowed her to see in detail the pattern of glass on the boardroom table, the shadow of a gull on the river, the clean line where a future meets its present. If the story has a last image, it is not of vengeance but of composure. Vivian walking away from a man who had tried to make her absence into his property, leaving him bankrupt and accountable, and stepping toward a life she chose rather than one that had been handed to her. She did not gloat, she did not roar. She simply moved forward, clear-eyed and steady, and in that composed departure she reclaimed the thing that had once been taken, the right to see. For more stories of justice, consequence, and the slow dismantling of deception, subscribe and watch the next unfolding.